The meeting was scheduled for 11 in the morning, which was early for Lowe's Angels and even earlier, in certain ways, for Jim Morrison. He arrived on time, which surprised the people waiting for him. He was 27 years old, and he had been late to most things that the music industry had asked him to attend over the previous 4 years, not from arrogance, though the industry had decided to call it that, but from a deep and increasingly urgent resistance to the idea that his time belonged to someone else. That morning, he was on time. He sat down at the conference table in the Elektra Records office on La Chenega Boulevard and placed something on the table in front of him that nobody in the room had expected to see. Not a demo tape, not a set list, not a contract writer or a tour proposal or any of the other documents that passed across conference tables in the offices of major record labels in 1971, a poetry manuscript. He pushed it toward the center of the table and said, "This is what I want to do next." The silence that followed lasted long enough to become its own kind of answer. And in that silence, Jim Morrison understood something that he had been slowly understanding for years, that the version of him the industry had invested in, and the version of him that actually existed, had never been quite the same person. And the distance between them had been growing since the first night the Doors played to a sold-out crowd, and the world decided it knew exactly who Jim Morrison was. But to understand what Jim Morrison placed on that table in January 1971, you have to understand what the table had asked of him for 4 years before he walked into that room. The Doors' debut album arrived in January 1967, and the world received it like something it had been waiting for without knowing it was waiting. Light My Fire climbed to #1 and stayed there for 3 weeks. Break On Through announced something that rock and roll had not quite said before, not just rebellion but interrogation, not just energy but a genuine searching darkness that felt less like performance and more like philosophy set to a backbeat. Jim Morrison's voice was unlike anything on American radio. It did not ask permission. It did not make concessions. It arrived fully formed and completely serious, the voice of someone who had been thinking about these questions long before a microphone was placed in front of him. The fame that followed was enormous and immediate, and in Jim's experience of it, profoundly disorienting. He had wanted an audience for the poems. He had not anticipated that the audience would want to consume him along with them. By the end of 1967, his image had separated from his person and begun traveling independently through the culture, the leather pants, the dark hair, the stage presence that mixed vulnerability with confrontation in ways that made audiences feel simultaneously exhilarated and unsettled. Journalists called him the Lizard King. The name came from his own lyrics, which made it more confusing rather than less. He had written it as a metaphor. The world had decided it was a title. The band recorded 5 albums between 1967 and 1970. They were not all equal, nothing is, across 5 albums in 3 years, but they were all serious, all genuinely reaching toward something that the pop music of the era was not otherwise reaching toward. Jim Morrison wrote poetry on tour buses and in hotel rooms and in the margins of set lists and on the backs of whatever paper was available, because the writing was not something he did when conditions were right. It was something he did because it was the only way he knew to stay in contact with his own interior life, which the noise of fame threatened constantly to drown out. Robbie Krieger, the band's guitarist, would later describe Jim during the Strange Days recording sessions as the most focused person he had ever worked with and simultaneously the most absent. He was present for everything that mattered to him, the vocal takes, the lyrical decisions, the moments when the music was pressing against some edge that none of them could entirely name, and absent for everything else. The business of being a rock star, the interviews and the photo sessions and the label meetings, these were things Jim Morrison did with a quality of endurance rather than engagement. He showed up, he said what was required, and then he went back to the notebook. By 1969, the distance between what the industry wanted from Jim Morrison and what Jim Morrison wanted from himself had become a daily, grinding reality. The Doors were one of the most successful bands in America, and their frontman was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the touring schedule. He was exhausted by the version of himself he was required to perform in public, the Lizard King, the shaman, the dangerous edge of rock and roll. That persona had emerged from something real, had grown out of genuine artistic instincts and genuine personal darkness, but it had solidified into a fixed image that bore decreasing relationship to the person underneath. The mask had become so familiar that people had stopped looking for what was behind it. He published 2 books of poetry in 1969, The Lords and the New Creatures, both printed by a small press, distributed modestly, reviewed rarely. They were not the poetry of a rock star doing poetry on the side. They were the work of a person who had been thinking seriously about language and consciousness and the limits of expression for as long as he had been doing anything at all. The critical reception was sparse and somewhat condescending. Reviewers could not quite locate Jim Morrison outside the context of the Doors, and the poetry suffered for being read through that lens. But the publication mattered to him more than any album chart position he had achieved, because it was the closest he had come to presenting himself to the world on his own terms, without the machinery of the band and the label and the mythology mediating between the work and whoever was receiving it. He was still writing. That was the constant that ran through everything: the recordings, the tour, the legal difficulties, the fraying of certain relationships, the gradual accumulation of evidence that the life he was living and the life he wanted to live were not converging. He was writing poetry that he did not record. He was writing essays about film that no one had asked for. He was filling notebooks with the same dense, reaching, question-pressing language he had been generating since he was a teenager reading Rimbaud in a naval officer's house in Florida, because the writing was not in service of the career. The career had always been in some fundamental sense in service of the writing, a way of reaching people, of getting the poems into the air, of closing the distance. And the career had become so enormous that it was now in service of itself, feeding on its own momentum, and the poems were getting harder to hear through the noise. The meeting at Elektra in January 1971 had been requested by Jim Morrison. That detail matters. He had called the label and asked to come in. He had something he wanted to discuss. The executives who gathered in the conference room that morning were expecting a conversation about the next album. The Doors had delivered L. Woman the previous year, and there was natural momentum toward whatever came next. What they were not expecting was a manuscript. Bill Siddons, the band's manager, was in the room. He had known Jim Morrison for 4 years, had managed the impossible logistics of keeping a band together whose frontman was simultaneously their greatest asset and their most unpredictable element. He watched Jim push the manuscript toward the center of the table and felt something shift in the room, not hostility exactly, but the particular tension that enters a space when someone says something that the space has not been designed to accommodate. Jim said, "I've been writing, not songs, poems. I want to publish another collection, and I want the label to support it the way they'd support an album. I want it reviewed seriously. I want it treated as the primary work, not as a side project from a rock musician." He said it quietly. That was the thing Bill Siddons would remember most clearly, not the content of the statement, which was surprising enough, but the quietness of it. Jim Morrison had spent 4 years delivering his words at considerable volume, through concert PA systems and studio microphones and the full amplification of celebrity. That morning in that conference room, he spoke at the volume of someone having a private conversation. There was no performance in it. There was only the statement and the manuscript on the table and the silence that gathered around both of them. The response from the executives was careful. Poetry was not a label priority. The market for poetry collections from rock musicians was unclear. What the label needed, what the fans needed, what the momentum of the band required was another album. Not immediately. There was some flexibility on timing, but the direction of travel was not in question. Jim Morrison had obligations. The label had invested significantly in those obligations. Poetry was a personal pursuit, and personal pursuits were fine, but they existed alongside the professional commitments, not instead of them. Jim Morrison listened to all of this. He did not argue. He picked up the manuscript from the center of the table and held it in both hands for a moment, not dramatically, not for effect, just held it the way you hold something when you are deciding whether to keep trying to explain what it means or to accept that the explanation is not going to land. Then he set it down beside him and said, "I understand." And then he said the thing that Bill Siddons would carry with him for the rest of his life. He said, "I just need you to know that this is the real work. The albums were how I found an audience for the poems. I'm not sure the audience I found is the audience for what I'm actually trying to say. but I'm going to keep saying it anyway because that's the only part of this I still know how to do without pretending. He flew to Paris 6 weeks later. He took the manuscript with him. He took a new notebook. He took Pamela Corson and one suitcase and the specific intention of finding out what happened to the work when the apparatus of the industry was no longer pressing against it from every direction. The label waited for the next album. The next album never came. What came instead, found in the apartment on Rue Beautreillis after Jim Morrison's death on July 3, 1971, was the notebook, dense with poems that no one had asked for and that bore no relationship to commercial expectations, and that said, in the particular way that only certain writing can say things, exactly what he had been trying to say for as long as anyone who knew him could remember. Ray Manzarek received the news of Jim's death in Los Angeles. He sat with it for a long time before he could speak about it publicly. When he finally did, what he said was not about the music or not. Only about the music, he said. Jim always believed the poems were the real thing. The songs were the poems finding their loudest possible voice, but the poems were what he came from and what he was always trying to get back to. Paris was him getting back to them. I just wish he'd had more time. The manuscript Jim Morrison placed on the Elektra Records conference table in January 1971 was eventually published posthumously, as part of the collected writings that Pamela Corson and the Morrison estate worked to bring into print after his death. It found readers, not the millions who had screamed his name in arenas, but the particular readers that serious poetry finds, the ones who come to it because they need it rather than because they have been told to. Those readers did not require the Lizard King. They required only the poems, and the poems were sufficient. Jim Morrison was 27 years old when he walked into that conference room and pushed a manuscript across a table and said quietly, without performance, "This is the real work." He was 27 years old when he died, 6 months later in Paris, with the notebook open on the desk. Some things are said once in a room where nobody is ready to hear them, and then the person who said them is gone, and the room fills up with the sound of everything that was not understood in time. The manuscript is still in print. The poems are still reaching toward the thing they were always reaching toward. And somewhere in the long, strange distance between a conference room in Los Angeles and a quiet apartment in Paris, Jim Morrison found, briefly and completely and on his own terms, exactly what he had been looking for. There is a particular kind of courage that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with dramatic gestures or confrontational speeches or the kind of scenes that later become mythology. It arrives quietly at 11 in the morning in a conference room on La Chenega Boulevard, in the form of a man setting a manuscript on a table and saying, "This is what I want to do next." The courage is in the quietness. The courage is in the absence of performance. The courage is in the fact that Jim Morrison, who knew how to command a room the way very few people in the history of popular music have ever known how to command a room, chose in that moment to speak at the volume of someone who has stopped needing to be heard by everyone and is now only interested in being understood by anyone. The people who were in that conference room in January 1971 all described the meeting differently in later years. As people always describe the same moment differently when they come to understand, in retrospect, what they were actually witnessing. The label executives remembered it as a difficult conversation about creative direction, not hostile, not dramatic, but fundamentally unresolvable, because what Jim Morrison wanted and what a major record label needed were not, at that particular junction, compatible things. Bill Siddons remembered it as the moment he understood that managing Jim Morrison was no longer a matter of logistics. It had become, whether he had the vocabulary for it at the time or not, a matter of watching a person choose between two versions of their own life, the version the world had constructed around them, and the version they had been protecting inside themselves all along. What none of them remembered, because none of them could have known it at the time, was that they were present at one of the last conversations Jim Morrison would ever have inside the American music industry. 6 weeks later he was in Paris. 6 months later he was gone. The meeting on La Chenega Boulevard was not a beginning. It was a threshold, the moment when the direction of travel became irreversible, when the choice between the persona and the poet was made, quietly and without drama, in a room full of people who were expecting a conversation about something else entirely. Jack Halsman, who had founded Elektra Records and had signed the Doors in 1966, was not in that January meeting. But he had known Jim Morrison long enough to understand something that the executives in the room were still working through. He understood that Jim had always been two things simultaneously: the performer who could hold 20,000 people in the palm of his hand, and the writer who needed, with an urgency that grew stronger rather than weaker as the years passed, to be left alone in a room with a blank page. The career had required the performer. Jim Morrison had always been trying to make space for the writer. Paris was that space. The manuscript on the conference table was the announcement that the space had become non-negotiable. There's a version of this story that frames it as tragedy: the artist destroyed by fame, the poet who never got to be only a poet, the young man who died before the work could become what it might have been. That version is not wrong exactly, but it is incomplete, because Jim Morrison was not destroyed by the music. He was complicated by it, compressed by it, forced into a shape that fit only partially, but the thing that mattered most to him, the writing, survived all of it. The notebooks survived. The manuscripts survived. The poems he wrote in Paris survived. They are quieter than the songs and less celebrated, and they reach fewer people, but they reach the right people, the ones who need them, the ones for whom the distance between one consciousness and another is a daily felt reality, and who find in those poems evidence that someone else felt it too and kept pressing language against it anyway. That is, in the end, what Jim Morrison was trying to tell the room on La Chenega Boulevard. Not that the music had not mattered, not that the 4 years of extraordinary, genuinely world-altering records had been a mistake or a compromise, but that underneath all of it, the thing that drove it was the poem, and the poem needed room, and the room was Paris, and he was going. He picked up the manuscript. He said he understood. He said, the only part of this I still know how to do without pretending, and then he left.